guys, and welcome back to another video on my channel. Just before we get into today's video, I do just want to give a warning that there might be some background noise. We're in the middle of a heat wave and it's pouring rain outside here right now, and my dogs just haven't got out much, so they're both really hyper. They're both actually sitting, like one's sitting here and there's that guy right there. So yeah, any background noises, there's not really much I can do about it if it's coming from them. But with that all being said, let's get right into today's video. Topic that we are going to be discussing today is one that I've known about for a long time, and I'm actually surprised that I've never covered it on this channel before. I feel like it's definitely something that would have been up my alley back when I started my YouTube channel, and I'm just not really sure why I didn't cover it, but I'm going to cover it today, and I think that you guys are going to be super interested in this topic, as I know that I am. Today we're going to be talking about the very strange disappearance of a musician by the name of Jim Sullivan. Now, James Anthony Sullivan was born on August 13th, 1939 into an Irish blue-collar family in Nebraska, and he was one of the 7 sons. Now, his family would later move on to San Diego, and that is when James would start going by the name of Jim. Now, something I just want to address here before we get into the video is while I was writing, I kept alternating between James and Jim because he was born James, but his name changed to Jim later on in life, and I really hope I don't do that throughout today's video, but if I do, his name is Jim Sullivan, not James Sullivan. Anyways, in high school, Jim was a guitar player, and he was also a quarterback on the varsity football team, and while he was in high school, he met his future wife, Barbara, and they would go on to be married in 1960. Sullivan had a lot of endeavors in his life, and while in college, he even co-owned a bar that ended up being a failed investment. In the late 1960s, he wound up playing in a rock band called The Survivors, who were from San Diego and featured his sister-in-law as the lead vocalist. In 1968, Jim and his wife Barbara would relocate to LA, where Barbara would start working as a secretary at Capitol Records, and Jim would play music gigs at night in random bars. And while he was living out there, he actually created such like a little bit of a Hollywood group of people that he hung out with. He was pretty good friends with the actor Dennis Hopper, and this friendship even got him an acting job as an uncredited extra in the movie Easy Rider. Barbara would try actively but unsuccessfully over and over again to get her higher ups at Capitol Records to sign her husband, or at least get some interest in him, but this was a fail over and over again. So Jim just continued to play gigs at random bars. One night, Jim had been playing one of his gigs at the Raft Club in Malibu and piqued the interest of actor Albert Allen Dobbs. Dobbs thought Jim was insanely talented and decided he wanted to gather the funds to get Jim a record deal. And that's when Moon Records was founded with the purpose of getting Jim a deal. It was because of this that Jim Sullivan was able to release his first record, UFO, which was folk music, and it had kind of like a mystical, spiritual nature to the lyrics and the music that he was producing and singing on this album. Nothing really came of this album at all, and within 2 years, Jim had then released another album called Jim Sullivan, and this album was released by Playboy Records, but again, this was ultimately a failure. And with both of these records being a failure, this put a lot of strain on Jim and Barbara and their relationship, and they started to really struggle financially as well as in their marriage. And because of all of the stress of all of these things that were going wrong in Jim's life, this is when he really turned to alcohol, which, as we all know, can sometimes make a bad situation that much worse. In 1975, after several years of struggling, Jim decided to see that if he could make it with his career of being a musician in Nashville. He's seen other people do it before, and he thought that this could be his big break. He decided to move out there alone and see if he could make a break and become, successful at being a musician out there. And if he was, then he would send for his family and they would follow him shortly after, also moving to Nashville if everything worked out. So on March 4th, 1975, Jim loaded up his Volkswagen Bug of all of the things that he thought that he would need, and he left from California heading towards Nashville. So on March 4th, 1975, Jim loaded up his Volkswagen Bug of anything that he thought that he could possibly need, and he headed from California to Nashville, Tennessee. Now, just a few hours into the drive, Jim got pulled over by a cop who suspected that Jim was drinking or driving under some kind of influence. They did a sobriety test on Jim and he passed, but the cop still suggested that this was a good time to take a break and basically told Jim that he needed to spend the night in a hotel. Jim would check into the La Mesa Motel in Santa Rosa, New Mexico, and after checking in, he would then call his wife Barbara and then head to the liquor store to buy some vodka. But after these occurrences took place, this is where things become very, very foggy. It had turned out that Jim had never slept in the motel room that he had paid for, and at some point over this night, Jim had driven right out of Santa Rosa, New Mexico. In the afternoon of March 5th, Jim was spotted on a ranch owned by the Garnett family, 26 miles from Santa Rosa. This was known because allegedly at some point Jim had been driving down the road when he had passed some of the ranch hands, and he had a couple words with one of the women that they were with, and she said that Jim seemed a little snippy, but there wasn't really too much to this, just that gave us a timeline of when he arrived in this area. That evening, Jim would leave his Volkswagen Bug on the ranch property and was spotted walking off into the desert. And that last sighting of Jim walking into the emptiness that is the desert surrounding that ranch area is the last known sighting ever of Jim Sullivan. After a few days had passed when Jim didn't call Barbara, she began to worry and she called authorities, and that is when his disappearance started to be investigated by the Santa Rosa authorities, and that was when they were able to track his Volkswagen Bug down to the Garnett Ranch. His car was discovered by police. They had found that every single thing that Jim had brought with him was still inside the vehicle, including his money, which you would think if you were going to disappear, you would need. Everyone at the ranch was questioned, but all that they could confirm was that somebody had seen Jim walk off the ranch property into the desert, and besides that, they had no information on this man at all. On March 8th, Jim's Volkswagen Bug was towed off of the property of the ranch, and it is assumed that the car was taken into police custody, but what had actually happened to this car is completely unknown and has never been released to the public. Nobody knows where his car went. And that usually is something that would be public, so that's pretty weird. For the next few weeks, it is said that residents and authorities searched the area with no sign of Jim, as well as his family making their way down to the area to also help in the search. Shortly after Jim's disappearance, the entire Garnett family, who were the people who owned the ranch that Jim was last seen on, moved to Hawaii, and around the same time, the head sheriff of the Santa Rosa Police Department retired. And this put a huge rift in the case, as none of those people were ever questioned again, and there was no more information that you could get out of them because the Garnett family was just gone and the sheriff was no longer included in this case, which put a huge rift in this investigation, obviously. It has been nearly 50 years since Jim Sullivan has disappeared, and there has never been any information on what happened to him or any indication on where this man could have gone. Now it's time to talk about some theories on what people think could have happened to Jim Sullivan. The first theory that I want to talk about in this case is foul play, and this could take several different paths, so we're going to talk about a few of them before we go on to any other theory. Shortly after Jim's disappearance, there was a body found around the area that he had vanished in that strongly resembled that of Jim Sullivan. It was published in a paper that his body had been found, and then later on it was published again that it actually wasn't Jim that was found, and that was really all the information that was given. They thought it was him, and then it turned out not to be. However, with that, there was never any information on whose body this was that was found, and as far as my research that I could find, there was nobody else in that area that fit Jim's description that was missing at that time. And the strangest thing is that the man whose body was found fit the description of Jim Sullivan to a T. The that was printed in the paper read, a Caucasian male about 6 foot 2 inches tall, weighing 180 pounds. The police said that the man appeared between the ages of 30 to 40 years old. The man had a tattoo on his right forearm, a mustache, and a small beard. And this sounds like an exact description of Jim Sullivan. Now this obviously would go hand in hand if this was Jim and this was some kind of identity cover-up, that this would involve foul play and that this was again some kind of cover-up, especially with the description fitting Jim almost to a T. Like this is definitely sounds like this is Jim Sullivan if I'm gonna be blunt here. And also too with the fact that the sheriff retired shortly after it starting to investigate this case, the entire thing just seems really weird and seems like some kind of cover. Now this makes the entire thing seem really sketchy and seem like some kind of cover up. It seems that the papers somehow got word that Jim's body was discovered, and then the police didn't like this or somebody didn't like this and told them to retract the information that they put out to the public, so they came forward saying that it wasn't Jim's body. This is very strange, especially compared to the fact, or I guess like clumped in with the fact, that the sheriff also retired shortly after starting to investigate Jim's disappearance. It is speculated that there's a possibility that, you know, when Jim got pulled over at that point, when they made him take the sobriety test that he witnessed something that he wasn't supposed to and he was dealt with. There's also a possibility that if Jim had caused trouble when he got pulled over, that the police just wanted his body out of their jurisdiction and they didn't think they'd have to deal with it, so they just disposed of it. This kind of also seems a little likely, as one of the police made a comment about Jim being trouble or something along those lines after he had vanished, and that kind of makes it seem like the police in that area were just annoyed with him being there. So possibly, like I said, maybe they'd found the body at some point and maybe it just, you know, come to nature, and they didn't want to deal with the disappearance, they didn't want to deal with the investigation, so they moved the body out of their jurisdiction thinking nobody would find it and they'd never have to deal with it, and that came back to bite them in the butt, as it should, because that, if that is the case, is absolutely disgusting. Now, another thing that goes into the police in this investigation being very shady is that there was never any official missing persons report ever filed for Jim Sullivan, and I mean ever. And again, like I said, he is going on now to be missing for almost 50 years. Of course, there are other foul play theories in this case that have nothing to do with law enforcement. It is speculated that the mafia might have had something to do with Jim Sullivan's disappearance, and there are rumors that the Garnett family, who owned the ranch that Jim's car was found on, had close ties to the mafia, and then shortly after Jim disappeared, they moved away to Hawaii, never to be heard from again, which does seem very odd, but there is nothing to back up this theory besides rumors. Another possibility that I just want to really quickly brush over, that I'm going to clump into two possibilities here, is that Jim Sullivan just wandered into the desert and it was as simple as that, and he succumbed to the elements. One, he was a heavy drinker. Maybe he was drunk, accidentally stumbled into the desert, got lost, and couldn't find his way back. Or two, and much more morbidly, maybe Jim Sullivan went out there to take his own life. His life seemed like it was falling apart, and maybe he just didn't think that there was a reason to live anymore. But obviously, we don't know that either of these two theories are the case. Before I brush past this theory, I do just want to mention a conversation that Jim had with his former producer years before he had disappeared. One night after heavily drinking, really late into the hours, the two, Jim Sullivan and his producer, got into deep drunk conversation, and they were talking about what they would do if they ever needed to disappear. And Jim Sullivan told the producer that he would just simply walk off into the desert and never come back. And that is really odd considering what happened to him. The last theory that I'm going to talk about in this case, which is actually a very popular one, which I think is why this case gets so much attention, although I'm not sure, is that there was a paranormal aspect to Jim Sullivan's disappearance, and that he was abducted by aliens. Not only was Jim Sullivan only about 100 miles north of Roswell and only 400 miles away from Area 51, but people think that his song UFO was a foreshadowing of what ended up happening to him. Post the lyrics on the screen here so you can read them if you want, but basically, as you can probably guess, the lyrics of the song talk about a man wandering off alone and being abducted by aliens. Aliens, astrology, UFO, and things of that nature were something that Jim and his wife Barbara shared a huge interest in, and Barbara would later come out and say that she took comfort in the thought that maybe Jim was abducted and that he was out there still alive somewhere in another universe or something like that. And I think her saying this is what really instigated this theory, as there really isn't any evidence to suggest that Jim was abducted by aliens, but yet again, there also isn't any evidence to suggest that he wasn't. This just isn't something that would have ever come up if he hadn't released the album called UFO and his wife hadn't said that. One of Jim's 3 sons, Chris Sullivan, has also spoken about what he thinks happened to his father, and he believes that Jim had just met the wrong person or made the wrong person angry, and that foul play was definitely involved in his father's disappearance. There are also several people that still believe that Jim could be alive, or that he just chose to live out his older years under a different name somewhere else. Jim's disappearance, Light in the Attic Records re-released UFO in 2010, bringing Jim's music to a wider audience and sparking renewed interest into his case. They had also released some of his previously unreleased demos, and since that time, Jim Sullivan's music, particularly the album UFO, have developed a cult-like following, and many people have become obsessed with this case. But unfortunately, to this day, we still have no idea what became of Jim Sullivan. And guys, that's going to bring us to the end of today's video. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. Don't forget to comment down below what you'd like to see in my future videos, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on that notification bell so that you don't miss any future videos from me. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye guys.